Hello, and welcome to another special edition of SpectrumCast. Today, in our next Modern Data Protection series, we're going to dive into tape-based media for your backups. Along with our panel as well as special guests, we will share some of our best practices and things to think about when architecting data protection with tape. Stay tuned. All right, welcome to another edition of SpectrumCast. I'm here again with my host, Randy Arsenault.
Hey, Steve.
Howdy. And our two subject matter experts, Trisha Jang and Sean Sperry.
Hi, Steve.
Hi.
And
today
else?
we have a special guest, Ace Lopez, our resident tape expert here at IBM, and we're really excited to have a thoughtful conversation today around tape. Now, I think over the course of the last decade, or probably even 2 decades, and Ace can tell me if I'm right or wrong here, we've seen the rise of tape during the times when folks were looking for better performance around tape, and tape, because due to data growth, we saw a fall in tape as people started to write to disk. And now all of a sudden we're seeing this resurgence in tape. And we want to kind of get to the bottom of this and kind of find out some great use cases for still leveraging tape and the ability to continue to use tape. So with that, let me turn it over to nice one, Randy. Linear media is sexy. There we go.
It is. It really is. You know, I really believe that.
Let's take a quick step. Let's turn it over to Ace. And Ace, tell us a little bit about what you've seen with tape over the course of the last few years or so.
Sure, yeah. We like to call it the Renaissance of tape. It sounds much more French, I guess. So we're seeing a resurgence in tape, and it is primarily because data is growing at such a huge rate with AI and big data applications coming on board every day. You know, there's this, there are a couple of charts out there about the internet minute, and it says every minute, all of these things are happening in terms of storage of data. And the data is just becoming so big that there just isn't enough disk to store it all, or to store what you want to store. And also, we're seeing not only big data, but the other part is that the areal density of disk technology is flattening out. So the old Moore's law or Kreider's law of getting twice as much capacity every 18 months, that's flattening out. So what's happening is those two together, lots of data growth, but disk areal density from a technology point of view, not growing as aggressively as it was, has people looking for a technology that they can grow with that's very affordable, and that's where we come in with tape. So the cost proposition of tape, and the rule of thumb I use when I talk to clients is less than a penny per gigabyte. In fact, it can actually be half a penny a gigabyte, but less than a penny per gigabyte is easy to remember, and it's not hard to achieve it. And so there's that. And then along with this is scaling of tape. And I mentioned the areal density of disk, but if you look at the areal density growth with like what INSIC, INSIC, is showing for, its kind of areal density roadmap. Tape is just, from the lower left to the upper right, just a nice straight line continuing to grow. And in conversing with our researchers in Zurich and in Tucson, I asked them just straight out, is there a point in time that you can see where tape's going to hit the same problem that disk has hit in terms of areal density? And they said not for decades. So, that growth of tape, areal density means that every year, 2 years, they're going to get twice as much capacity for the same dollar. And that's what people need when they're growing, at 30% a year. So our storage capacity is growing for tape is growing greater than the organic growth of data at 30% a year.
So,
And then, of course, then the final leg, so cost and then scaling, and then the final leg really is security. Because tape has an inherent built-in security, which is the air gap, a physical air gap. And what that means is that the systems that generate the data are separated from the data sitting on a cartridge at rest. And therefore, ransomware and other malware cannot reach that physical cartridge. And so it gives you that extra layer of protection for it.
Yeah, so I can just anecdotally add that Steve and I get into frequent nerd fights about the fact that tape does indeed have the only purely physical air gap by definition. So fully with you on that.
Yeah, exactly. So those are the pillars, Steve. Cost, scale, and security.
Oh, go ahead.
I was going to say, if someone hadn't looked at tape like in 5-10 years, can you give me some hard numbers on that aerial density growth that they would see if they went into the market now?
Sure. And it continues. We continue to demonstrate higher and higher capacity. So today, the highest capacity cartridge is 20 terabytes, which is Enterprise Tape Drive 1160, TS 1160. What we've demonstrated with Sony is an aerial density that will achieve 330 terabytes per cartridge. So that's over 16 times current capacity. Now, when we do that demo, and we did this, we proved this, this is 20, so about a year and a half, 2 years ago. When we prove this and demo it, it takes about 8 to 10 years to actually show up in production. So we can expect a 330 terabyte cartridge in the time frame of about 2029 or something like that. So, but we continue to explore with Fuji, for instance. We're looking at another test which will even take us, further than 330 terabytes of cartridge. So that's what I meant by continued linear growth of storage capacity on tape.
It's very impressive. So, Sean, I wanted to ask you, you were a big proponent of, hey, let's have tape as a conversation on the next Vodcast. Give me some of your thoughts about what you're seeing around tape and tape-based protection and that sort of thing.
Well, I think some of the use cases that Ace laid out have really come into play recently, particularly with regard to cyber resiliency and these attacks, right? The fact that tape is the only medium where you get a true air gap, meaning you can need human intervention to actually get to the data, has promoted its use and really made it almost a requirement in a lot of environments, right? We just have to have that sort of protection on at least one copy of our data. Certainly the cost comes into play. And I think particularly in one of the areas that we see it a lot in the data protection spaces with long-term retention, right? Because the use case we see is not necessarily the same as spanning disk or object storage, but this use case where we have to have this for 5 years, 10 years, 20 years, just in case we might need it, but we probably won't. And that really lends itself to the cost effectiveness of tape, because in many cases, those tapes don't have to even be online, right? They can just be put in storage there and used in that just in case scenario.
Tricia, you asked a lot about leveraging tape with Spectrum Protect and Protect Plus?
We're asked a lot. And what I see is people trying to compare tape versus the cloud, and asking, what are the benefits of going to the cloud, which I also hear are cheap, versus going to tape. And other than the cyber resiliency and the even cheaper cost for tape, I think one thing that appeals to a lot of companies is the possession. They possess, they own, they have in-house those tapes. They're not shipping their data off to somebody else's IT center like you do in a third-party cloud. And that's very big deal to a lot of companies.
Sovereignty and security of data, big deal. Yep.
What are you seeing, Steve?
I definitely think the platforms. I liked Sean's. Ace's kind of the renaissance of tape. From the standpoint of, I agree with Sean. Number one, we started to see before all the cyber incidents about 12 to 18 months ago started to hit. We started to see that long-term retention, to Ace's point, when you can start saving data at a penny a gigabyte. And to Sean's point, who knows if I'm going to need it, but I want to keep it around. The fact that I can store it really inexpensively was nice. What I also happened to notice, well, the air gapping, obviously, but also the other thing I happened to notice, and Ace, I'd be curious your comments, right? The performance of tape. We always talk about, the rise and the fall. The rise was, of course, tape was a great medium to store data for protection, right? For security purposes and that sort of thing, and cost purposes. But then it got to be, I need my data really fast. So I was backing it up to disk, and we saw this kind of fall of tape. But I don't think, and it wasn't until we had done a lot of work around tape and tape performance that people really understood, sure, time to first byte takes a bit, but tape is incredibly fast. And I think the more and more people started to understand that, and you add on these other use case or other business needs that clients needed for tape, whether it be long-term retention or air gapping and that sort of thing, did clients say, yeah, I don't need to put this on disk, even if it is cheap disk, because tape is clearly the cheapest. Ace, any comments both about the performance, and Tricia had asked you about the linear density. I know we have LTO9 coming out soon, Q4, I believe I just heard. Want to elaborate a little bit on those?
Sure, yeah. So first on the point you made, we're kind of I think in our, in this generation, in this age, everything's got to be fast. I want it now. And clearly when we go, to search something on Google, we type it in, and if it takes, more than 6, 7, 8 seconds, we're starting to get impatient, and then forget that. I'll go somewhere else, right? So we're kind of give it to me right now generation. But in actuality, as you said, we do not need everything right now. And there are many workloads that, in fact, don't need data instantaneously. And we think that's a lot of it. And in fact, 80% of the world's data, especially within enterprise environments or corporations, is cold. It hasn't been accessed in 6 months. So really, you can make the case that if you need data that you haven't accessed in 6 months, you probably don't need it within milliseconds. Can you wait a minute if it's sitting out on tape to go get it? And we're finding the answer more is yes, because why would you have data that you're not accessing, for 6 months or more, spinning, taking up space on your disk, and consuming electricity and so on. So I think the big shift that people are starting to realize is that, hey, a lot of my data is cold. I don't have to have it on a technology that's costing me, and I can have it on a cartridge. And it's okay if it takes 60 seconds. On average, to get to the first byte.
And something like video on demand is a great example of that, right? So look at Comcast or Xfinity or any of the big media providers. I mean, to be able to host the volume of data they have and the size of their media libraries and the assets they have under management, the only practical way from a cost standpoint is to store that on linear media. So they've developed these really interesting, kind of very sophisticated hybrid models that use Flash as a front-end cache layer for, time to first byte, and then hand off to, the linear media for streaming the remainder, which is brilliant and is being used by virtually every large media provider. So really cool workloads and use cases.
What about the network going in, though? Are you seeing a lot of land-free still, or is the network strong enough now we don't even have to consider land-free environments?
Well, I think, from my perspective, it certainly does in some cases put more stress on the network environment, network infrastructure. But the other advantage, the kind of secondary or collateral advantage of these hybrid workloads using flash and other caching layers in conjunction with linear media like tape, is that the ability to apply codecs and compression and kind of data manipulation in stream is also much easier, and in many cases is even baked into the solution. Excuse me. So I think that also reduces the bandwidth requirements pretty significantly. So, and there's other examples. I use video on demand as one that I think is pretty popular, but there are others as well. I think where we're seeing that too, like huge research data sets is another example. Ace probably sees, all kinds of interesting workloads like this, but fair question. I think that's my perspective.
I think we've kind of, from a performance perspective, I think we've kind of talked about it, but not said it outright. Tape has, from a performance perspective, tape is wonderful with regard to streaming large data sets, right? As a matter of fact, probably faster than disk in many regards, right? But when it comes to some of the workloads that we see in our data protection business, like small little bursts of data or small files, say, maybe it's not as good. So that kind of speaks to where it's best used. And the use case with the streaming video is just an example of that, right? We're pulling the first small bit off of SSD and then going to the tape for streaming the large data. And in that use case,
migrating and tearing down from a disk storage pool in Spectrum Protect out to tape.
Yeah.
And at that point, we can get it streaming.
Every major Apex cloud provider does, right? I mean, all the big guys use tape as their cold archive tier because, again, it's economically viable.
Yeah. So let's we've definitely hit the use cases, right? The long-term retention, the lower cost. We've got performance, especially in some particular industry verticals. Trish and Sean, let me ask you, right? And Ace, we'll end with you, right? Let's think about when we are trying to provide advice to a client who may have left tape, may want to go back, has tape, but has seen this enormous data growth that we've been seeing over the course of the last decade. What advice do we give to clients about architecting tape and things to think about around a tape architecture to ensure that they have success with it and are happy with their implementation? Trisha, we'll start with you.
Yeah, so in Spectrum Protect, the first thing we're looking at is, like Sean said, what type of data are you writing? And are you writing direct to tape? Can you get that database backup streaming and really capitalizing on the tape speeds? Or do we need to set up a hierarchy and architecture solution so it's backing up to disk and then tiering or migrating to tape? And then the second thing you really got to consider in the strategy with Spectrum Protect is your DR strategy. And are you using tape to take off-site? If so, how are you tracking those tapes? Spectrum Protect has built in the disaster recovery manager piece. How are you, if there is a disaster, going back to Randy's comment about important data, what's important, where is that data situated? Does it have its own dedicated set of tapes so we can restore faster? So looking at the DR scenarios as well.
And quick
Sean?
shout out for Spectrum Discover in that use case.
That is a good point, right?
Yeah. I mean, as with all of these architectures, right, our data protection, Tricia and I are experts in Spectrum Protect, right, which is our data protection product. And Spectrum Protect really supports almost all of these storage and media architectures. And I think a lot of this does come down to use case and cost, right? I mean, you obviously want the architecture that's going to meet your needs from an SLA and a use case perspective, but you also want it at the least cost. And tape can be one of the things that comes to play in that. And to me, there's like no clear advantage, where somebody says, well, spinning disk is always best, or object storage is always best, or tape is always best. We rarely see that in an architecture, we usually see some hybrid mixture of those type of things to meet the need.
And to meet the different data types.
And
Right.
to meet the different data types, and to meet the cost objectives as well as the SLA and time to restore perspective.
So Ace, if I'm a client, or even a seller approaching a client, what are some of the key questions I should be thinking about, or I should be asking myself to say, maybe I left tape, but maybe I want to come back, right? And what types of things do I think about that let me believe some of those things would help me probably maybe reinvest in tape?
So one of the first questions I always ask is, how much of your data is cold?
Cold?
Yeah, cold. Now, they don't typically really know that, but we offer a study. It's an SIO study, ArcScan study, complimentary, to help them understand what's hot and what's not. And usually when we profile that account, a client can see that 60 and 80% of their data is cold. So then the next question that can follow once they understand that is, why are you putting it on disk, or why are you putting it on a NetApp filer? And now you're going to go spend more money on more NetApp filers because your data is growing. So one of the questions really is cold data. How much of your data is cold? Related to this, though, we're finding more and more that one of our key competitors is not the traditional competitors, but it is AWS or Amazon. And when we have that conversation, I always like to ask them if they bring it up. Usually they bring it up, say, "Oh, we're going to the cloud. We're going to the cloud." So what I usually say there is, if you're going to the cloud, are you using Amazon Glacier? Because if you're using Amazon Glacier, your data is still on tape. It's just
I was going to ask you, is it truly a competitor, right? It's just a different cost model. It's really the same technology.
Yeah, it's a competitor to us as IBM if they go to Amazon, but it's the same underlying technologies. And the major hyperscalers are in conversation. And this past week alone, I was in 3 conversations with 3 major hyperscalers who are exploring how to scale and design tape in their environment. You'd know all the names. And what I usually say to clients is, what do they know that you don't? What are the hyperscalers, the people who store zettabytes of data? What are they looking at and why? And should you pay them 10 times more than it would cost you to have an on-prem tape? Or, if you have a small amount of data, that's fine. But if you have any amount of data at all that's, fairly sizable, you're getting into petabytes, storing it on Amazon, for instance, can be pretty costly. But in any case, the thing I try to help clients understand is, you will be putting it on tape technology. Either you'll pay somebody else to put it on tape technology, or if you want, we can help design an on-prem solution. Small businesses, we scale down with our libraries. So to meet those needs, but we also are dealing with hyperscalers, which store, exabytes and upwards of zettabytes of data. So that's the beautiful thing about the IBM storage portfolio. It's scalability, and the tape part of it has different solutions to meet different market needs.
Yeah,
Ace, I think you answered this question, but I'd be interested in maybe calling it out. How does the cold storage tiers of AWS and Azure compare with an on-premise tape? The cost of those. I mean, I would imagine they're considerably more expensive because you're paying for them to manage the solution for you.
It's cheap to put the data up there. It's really expensive to get it back.
Yeah, the total cost of ownership that our own internal studies have showed is 10 times less expensive for an on-prem tape solution than for Amazon Glacier, and 20 times less expensive than Amazon S3.
I mean, and that's the problem with all cost architectures, right? This operational model sounds. We had this discussion a week ago, as a matter of fact, or a couple of weeks ago. This operational model is very appealing, right? The first one's really cheap. It's only when you get out there and start to use it that the bills start to come in and pile up, right? So you really have to do a good analysis of your use case, how much you're going to use to do the comparison.
Absolutely.
Ace, does your analysis also say if they have older tape drives, what the benefit would be to upgrade to the latest tape drives? With Spectrum Protect, we can move the data to the new tape technology, but would your analysis show the benefits?
Yeah, we actually have some really great tools, sales tools out there that you can plug in your old IBM tape drives and cartridges and capacity in the generation you're using, as well as competitor stuff. So it's kind of cool. So you type in, in this little spreadsheet, and this little calculator will show that if you are going to TS1160, you're going to LTO 8 or LTO 9, which we announced this quarter or Q4. It shows you, the savings, the capacity, what your footprint would look like in the new environment. So absolutely, we have a lot of tools to help clients move off of the old to the new, if they want to do that.
Ace,
sometimes they just have it out there just sitting there,
Ace, thank you very much. Sean, I want to thank you for recommending this conversation, because I think it's one of those topics that people don't think a lot about. They think about data protection, they think about tape. I don't know that they necessarily always put them together. But the resurgence of tape and the renaissance of tape and the comeback that we've seen has really changed the thinking of IBM's deployment around the different storage technologies, whether it be disk or tape or flash, to solve different problems. So I want to thank you. Ace, I want to thank you again. You've been a great guest. Any parting words? We'll start with Randy.
Just this again.
Good one.
I mean, I talk to clients and partners and executives a lot about, cost models and consumption models and how to operationally and economically optimize your storage environment. And I have found, doing this for many, many years, that tape is quite literally, for all the reasons we've talked about, the easiest story to tell when it comes to the economic model. I mean, it's indisputable, right? You cannot dispute the cost of storing data, large volumes of data. Now, there's obviously, tipping points in capacity where it may make more or less sense, but from a pure, apples to apples economic perspective, it's an easy story to tell, I think. So,
great, Tricia.
Yeah, I was going to say Spectrum Protect has been doing tape since our conception over 25 years ago. So we've got a lot of great technology built in. We support a lot of different tape types. We do things like reclamation, offsite tracking. So Spectrum Protect is really robust when it comes to tape support.
Ace?
Yeah, I mean, we've talked a lot about physical tape, and I spend a lot of time there. That's where a lot of the trend is towards with hyperscalers, for instance. Look at your workload, look at your profile of your data, and then figure out where's the best place to put it for the cost, for the value of the data, for its utility. And our IBM portfolio has a solution or a combination of solutions that you can put together to satisfy those needs.
Great. Thank you, Ace. And I think you hit on an important topic that we hit on in the very first podcast we had. We talked about how to architect data protection for data at scale, or the need to classify data at scale in order to align to Ace's key comments around how and when and why to use tape, right? So if you're not classifying your data, you don't understand what data you have or how old it is or where it's going, and to Tricia's point, the tiering of data, right? you can really take advantage of tape and reduce your overall operational expense as well as your capital expense by taking advantage of it. I highly encourage everyone to take a look at their data, start to classify it, think about how to leverage tape and how to use tape in those environments to be able to help them reduce costs. And obviously, if you're thinking about cybersecurity and you really want that, or you need that true air gap because you need to for corporate compliance, tape is your answer. So I want to thank everybody for joining this episode of SpectrumCast. And next week, we're going to talk about protecting container environment, something that is becoming more and more of a necessity for clients as they move forward in these new born on the cloud applications. So thank you, everybody. I appreciate your time, and we'll talk to you next week.